On the morning of September 11th, 2001, when four commercial flights, passenger planes, were hijacked and used as guided missiles against U.S. targets, at that moment the casus belli of the Centcom era was crystallized. Whatever the causes before, however dispersed and inchoate those causes may have been, they were now focused and clear. Combating terrorism, defeating it for the extremely optimistic or maybe the naive, became the new mandate. And it was a true aim. 2,977 people died in the attacks of 9/11, and uncounted numbers of especially first responders died after the fact of cancers developed after breathing in the remains of the falling towers. Don DeLillo is an American novelist and New York native whose article, which you read, appeared in Harper's December 2001 issue. In that article, DeLillo does two things. First, as Chris Hedges has put it in another context, he, quote, reduces the moral universe to caring for another human being. He focuses on the experience of individual people, especially of the family of his nephew, blocks from the falling towers. The people gathered in a hallway, running in the street, the children scared, the families huddled in makeshift shelters, staying wet, eating food. He reminds us, as novelists do, of the human experience, tries to elicit in us something of the immediacy of terror. And he does something else as well. He considers, as most Americans did not, in the immediate aftermath of the attack, what might have caused this, what might have drawn their fury. He considers the possibility that American culture, American society, might have had a hand in setting the stage for the attack, might have played a role. He says, the power of American culture to penetrate every wall, home, life, and mind was a power against which those 19 men sought a violent response. The possibility that technology, with its unfettered momentum, the surge of capital markets, as he puts it, that dominated discourse and shaped global consciousness, might be a problem for the traditionally religious, living under the occupied aftermath of colonial control. He writes, they see something immediately destructive in the nature of technology. It brings death to their customs and beliefs. This isn't an apologist article. It doesn't say that the attacks were justifiable, doesn't suggest that those who went to work on Tuesday morning and then held hands to jump to their death from buildings on the brink of collapse, doesn't suggest that they somehow deserved this. But it does seek to understand what happened, and to understand it even from the perspective of those whose unforgivable actions rained death on the streets of Manhattan and Washington, D.C., and on that field in Pennsylvania. He writes, we are rich, privileged, and strong, but they are willing to die. That's the edge they have, the fire of aggrieved belief. What he does suggest is that understanding the motivations of our enemies may help to enrich and enhance our understanding of ourselves. With the end of communism, he writes, the ideas and principles of modern democracy were seen clearly to prevail. The preservation and defense of modern democracy, we've seen, has provided the United States with its explicit motivation for waging war since at least World War I, dedicated itself to making the world safe for it. In a telling and honest terminological shift, Bill Clinton's national security advisor began in the 90s to talk about, quote, market democracies. Here, our language recognizes what has been true for some time, that modern democracy required free market capitalism. This is globalization through the dollar. And religion in all cases, except maybe in that very strange union of American Christianity with the gospel of prosperity, seemingly counter to the words and deeds of its central figure, Jesus, accepting that possible and very cynical counterpoint, religion was in all cases marginalized. Faith in religion was relegated to the past. Faith in the market would prevail in governing the present. This was especially problematic for the Muslim world, from Bosnia to Iran to Somalia. So DeLillo considers this. With the fall of communism, what could possibly counter the force of capitalism? Because with the global war on terror, unlike with the Cold War, America was not the only one with God on their side. In fact, the terrorist forces claimed God's protection and approval with a fervency that America, had long since let go. So would it be technology versus God, market democracies versus traditional religion? There are no easy answers here, and DeLillo offers none. What he does is offer an isolated, anecdotal, imagistic moment at the end of the essay that might point to the possibility of a kind of reconciliation. Allahu Akbar. God is great. The last words of terrorists flying passenger planes into U.S. targets, also the last words of this essay. In a recent New York Times op-ed about Confederate monuments, Elliot Ackerman writes that, quote, if we hope not to pass along today's battles to our children, then we have to begin the shift from reckoning to reconciliation. Remember, if there be troubles, let them be in our time, that our children may know peace. Standing as we are now at the historical moment when the children of those who enlisted and deployed in the immediate martial aftermath of 9/11 are themselves enlisting and deploying to the same combat zones, can we begin that shift? Is there reconciliation possible between the two dominant ideological forces operating on the global scene today? I don't know. If there is, then I suspect that it will require a dedication to a greater self-reflection and situational awareness. Martin Luther King said that we don't make history, history makes us. And I think he's right, but we do make the future. That's the corollary. And in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, America did not, on the whole, turn to a greater self-reflection or situational awareness. Niall Ferguson has said that 9/11 was a turning point in history, when history failed to turn. And maybe this is what he means. As a whole, Americans did not consider history or our part in creating what was then the present. Donald Trump, then a real estate mogul and soon-to-be reality TV star, days after the 9/11 attack, discussing what to do with the site, said that we should build the towers back, but one floor higher. On 9/11 itself, hours after the attack, he made the point that Trump Tower was now the tallest building in New York. George W. Bush, then the president, urged Americans to go shopping, to go to Disney World, to live life the way we want it to be lived. We would go to war, but Americans would not change their lifestyle, would not consider the potentially negative character or global influence of the American way of life, the American freedom. The 1% made famous or infamous by the 2011 Occupy Wall Street movement have only gotten richer since then, and many of them through wars and the American process of militarization more generally. But they're not the only 1% relevant to this discussion. As Bacevich reminds us, the 1% of American population that currently owns over half of the nation's wealth is ideologically connected to the 1% of the American population that serves in the armed forces, battling abroad in defense of the American way of life enjoyed by the 99% consuming and oblivious at home. This connection is not one he goes easy on. As a retired Army colonel who has also lost a son in Iraq, the point for him is more than academic. He writes, American warriors may not win wars. In fact, America has lost more wars than it's won by a wide margin and has won no wars for decades. So they may not win wars, he writes, but they do perform the invaluable service of providing their countrymen with an excuse to avoid introspection. They make second thoughts unnecessary. In this way, the bravery of the warrior underwrites collective civic cowardice, while fostering a slack, insipid patriotism. Well before 9/11, but with a fervency in the post-9/11 world, war has become the permanent state of things. For America, there is no peacetime. And Americans have in large part chosen not to know, not to care. This civic complacency, this willful ignorance, it is complicity. Remember that we saw at the beginning of the course that in a 2018 poll, 42% of Americans did not know that their nation was still at war in Afghanistan, where we had at that point been for nearly 2 decades. We're still there. And Brown University's map, the first of its kind, you see here and current through 2017, shows that a shocking 39% of the world's countries are involved in the counter-terrorist war being waged by America. The willful ignorance of Americans about this is complicity. It is a tacit sanction. It is approval. So long as the government adheres to what Bacevich calls the 3 axioms of Americans' post-9/11 wartime role, then Americans support war. Those 3 axioms again. First, we will not change. The American way of life is sacrosanct. Second, we will not pay. There will be no new taxes to pay for this war. And third, we will not bleed. The 1% can be stop-lossed, can be compelled into multiple consecutive tours, but the 99% aren't going. America supports its troops in the most clear, nonpartisan issue of our time. America supports its troops, but from a safe distance. Service members are a society apart, and increasingly so. As draft-era veterans die, so too does the general American experience of knowing a veteran or an active duty service member in your family, in your neighborhood, in your workplace. For the most part, military service members are out of sight, out of mind. America supports its troops like it supported its first responders who ran into the falling towers and got cancer, but no health care in return. Like it supports the folks who in times of pandemic are known as essential workers, who risk their lives and the lives of their families to continue in their low-paying jobs without benefits, while the nation builds a wall to keep out the Latinx immigrants who are disproportionately represented in these jobs. And while congressionally supported and federally funded relief packages go to such struggling billionaire businesses as Kanye West's Yeezy brand, billionaire property developer Joe Farrell, Mitch McConnell's wife's Foremost Group, and several Kushner family holdings. America supports its troops on holidays with banners and beer and barbecues, so long as it never has to set foot in a VA hospital or, God forbid, a military base, so long as it doesn't have to even know that the nation is at war. Mostly, so long as Americans do not have to sacrifice any of the material comforts that have come to be equivalent with freedom in the American hearts and minds. 9/11 didn't come out of nowhere. After 9/11, though, America did have every rationale, every justification to crush the Taliban. And we did, just not effectively. The difference between the 9/11 attacks and the attack on Pearl Harbor, to which it's often compared, is that we're not fighting nation states anymore. What happened on 9/11 and continues in ground combat against non-state insurgent forces is that terrorists employ asymmetric military actions to meet a political end. No uniforms, no battlefields, no borders. Michael Collins, who was a central figure in 20th century Irish fights for independence, said this of this sort of warfare. He said, "You wear the clothes of the man in the street, you destroy, and then you disappear." No embedded insurgent population has ever been defeated. Constant guerrilla warfare works. The U.S. armed bin Laden to fight the Russians. He had an embedded insurgent military base. And they had a focus. They targeted what they saw as economic and military imperialism. And those targets were available. They were visible. And the war on terror is part of this. And it's interminable. And it might be right and it might be wrong, but one thing's for sure, the U.S. has not done the best job at aligning its mythos with its actions. America hasn't considered whether its governing myths match either its motivations or its methods, but it has continued to employ those myths. Basevich again. The new American militarism draws much of its sustaining force from myth, stories created to paper over incongruities and contradictions that pervade the American way of life. The exercise of global power by the United States aggravates these incongruities. And what is this myth? What's he talking about? We all saw the towers fall, and we changed our lives. The U.S. created the Department of Homeland Security. Turns out the Department of Defense had long been concerned not with defense, but with power projection. And the Transportation Security Administration was part of that. Air travel would never be the same. And the USA Patriot Act, actually an acronym, uniting and strengthening America by providing appropriate tools required to intercept and obstruct terrorism Act, it's kind of a brilliant acronym, opened private citizens to a level of government surveillance that was unprecedented and controversial. But Americans made real, verifiable changes in response to a real, verifiable attack. So what myth are we talking about? After the February 1993 explosion in the underground garage of the World Trade Center, which killed 6 people, and the August explosions the same year of the U.S. embassies in both Kenya and Tanzania, then President Bill Clinton said, "Americans are targets of terrorism because we have unique leadership responsibilities in the world, because we act to advance peace and democracy, and because we stand united against terrorism." Now, it's not that he's wrong, But here, as elsewhere, the story we tell ourselves about ourselves is a story according to which terrorism has nothing to do with U.S. foreign policy. Nothing to do with things like Clinton's June 1993 midnight bombing of Baghdad, with market democracies, or that white-hot limitless thrust of technology. As though these forces and these choices are value neutral. Now, they might be value positive, and they might conform to an authentically rendered version of the dominant American mythos. They might. But we don't know that unless and until we see them as not value neutral. A great many in the world, including the terrorists against which we wage perpetual war, already see them as not value neutral. On September 18th, 2001, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld said this: "We have a choice, either to change the way we live, which is unacceptable, or to change the way they live. We choose the latter." Again, he might be right. This might be the right position. That's really not the point. We did change the way we lived, increasingly surveilled, increasingly militarized. What was unacceptable really for the American people was accepting the possibility of change enough to consider how we might change, and to do so intentionally. The Third Gulf War ran officially from 2003, when George W. Bush invaded Iraq in search of those weapons of mass destruction, which did not exist. It ran from then until 2011. Now, what emerged from this is called the Bush Doctrine. It's a doctrine of preventive war. Preventive strikes, preemptive strikes here. If we wait for threats to fully materialize, we will have waited too long. Our security will require transforming the military you will lead. He's speaking to West Point cadets, graduates. A military that must be ready to strike at a moment's notice in any dark corner of the world. Now, a few months later, he articulates the Bush Doctrine explicitly. The first duty of the United States remains what it has always been: to protect American people and American interests. The greater the threat, the greater is the risk of inaction. To forestall or prevent such hostile acts by your adversaries, the United States will, if necessary, act preemptively in exercising our inherent right of self-defense. To confront threats before they emerge, in anticipatory self-defense. This is called preventive war, and it was explicitly condemned by the Nuremberg trials of 1946 as immoral and ethically baseless. By the end of 2004, we were spending about $7 billion a year. $7 billion a month in Iraq. Also in 2004, news and images of the atrocities at Abu Ghraib broke. This slide is intentionally left blank. If you've not seen images of the atrocities committed against imprisoned combatants or non-combatants at the Abu Ghraib prison, committed by U.S. service members, I recommend to you the movie The Report. I've shown a lot of horrific images in these slideshows, but I'm not ready or willing to show the images from that event, which are widely available online. But the myth of American militarization wasn't diminished through this. It wasn't somehow even tarnished. The myth remained beyond reproach. From Bush's second inaugural in 2005, he says, "From the day of our founding, we have proclaimed that every man and woman on earth has rights and dignity and matchless value because they bear the image of the maker of heaven and earth. Across the generations, we have proclaimed the imperative of self-government because no one is fit to be a master and no one deserves to be a slave. Advancing these ideals is the mission that created our nation. It is the honorable achievement of our fathers. And now it is the urgent requirement of our nation's security and the calling of our time." Now, besides being, at least in its uncomplicated portrayal, patently untrue in ways that I hope this semester has made clear, this statement coalesced in ways that compelled the American public several strands of the American myth, which has itself persevered. All the while, the pursuit of political aims and the pursuit of profit have remained intertwined and have become maybe inextricable. The institution and mobilization of the All-Volunteer Force, or the AVF, in the War on Terror meant that the past decades of the war would be waged by that 1%. And it meant that the mechanisms of war, the logistics, required the use of military contractors. As of 2010, there were far more military contractors in Iraq and Afghanistan than there were troops. Data on them is scarce. They are not required to make any particulars public. But a 2011 federal report conducted and, reported by the federal government showed that fraud and abuse in Iraq and Afghanistan had cost the U.S., that means taxpayers, and inevitably of the future, taxpayers of future generations, our children and their children after them, that this fraud and abuse had cost the U.S. about $12 million a day for the previous 10 years. This is an image of those much storied pallets of cash. $12 million a day, not in expenditures, in leakage, in fraud. $12 million a day went missing, unaccounted for, in cash. $12 million a day for 10 years. What's known as the Fourth Gulf War began in 2013. It has not yet ended. It's been waged against Daesh, ISIS, ISIL, the Islamic State. The target shifts, as does the geography. In the global war on terror, Americans have engaged the enemy in, we see this slide again, Iraq, Afghanistan, Lebanon, Grenada, Panama, Somalia, Haiti, Bosnia, Kosovo, Pakistan, El Salvador, Honduras, Colombia, Guatemala, Libya, the Sudan, and Yemen that we know of. On almost any measure, it has not been successful. Under American occupation, for instance, Afghanistan produced 90% of the world's opium. Attempts to curtail this, to build an alternate economy, cost the U.S. more in real dollars than did the Marshall Plan, which rebuilt Europe after the Second World War. And it didn't work. Under George W. Bush, the U.S. ended up spending over $600 billion a year on war. Now, President Obama ran on the promise to get America out of war, and his administration started referring to America's undeclared wars as, quote, overseas contingencies operations. So in name, maybe he did, maybe he got America out of war. We don't call it that anymore. By 2015, Centcom, also known as the Centcom, which is short for the Special Operations Command, it's one of those U.S. commands that's not geographically based, had 72,000 personnel operating in well over 100 nations. Again, the exact number is debated, 120-something, 130-something on the conservative end. This command initiates secret attacks in nations with which America is not at war, and it's been expanding. President Obama authorized far more drone attacks than did his predecessor, and that same trend holds with deportations. It's increasing, and more. His successor has authorized more, both drone attacks and deportations. They're going up. The trend on both of these is going up because American militarization, so clear and explicit, so direct in Department of Defense activities, that militarization also governs the home front in ways that the Kerner Report of 1968 saw led to injustice. It led to riots. Now, Senator and presidential candidate John McCain had a checkered political history from almost any perspective. He was in all cases against torture, having been a prisoner of war himself, but he was also in almost every case in favor of the systemic oppression of Black and brown people and of the poor. He did not vote to help those folks. He did vote always against torture. In his very brief farewell address, though, written from his deathbed, he gives us a compelling expression of America's conditional exceptionalism. He says, "We are citizens of the world's greatest republic, a nation of ideals, not blood and soil. We are blessed, and we are a blessing to humanity when we uphold and advance those ideals at home and in the world. When our actions align with the myths, or at least try to come to a closer alignment, a closer approximation. When we embody that definition of American exceptionalism that Obama articulated in his own presidential farewell address, where he said, quote, that we have shown the capacity to change and to make life better for those who follow. That we try, each of us try harder, to uphold and advance those ideals at home and abroad, ideals of universal human value, of liberty and justice for all, of equality under the law, and of the integration of diversity, a diversity of race, class, gender expression, political stance. The presidency of Donald Trump has not seen a commitment to this diversity. I have used the White House's own image of the presidents in a certain format with the number at the bottom left for each of the preceding presidents. Donald Trump has broken with that model, and this is, rather than the previous format, this is the format that he shows. So I've not given a new one. This is his official White House format, oriented clearly towards social media. His administration has not seen a commitment to this sort of diversity. In his 2015 announcement of his candidacy from the lobby of the Trump Tower, he already made clear his maybe just politically expedient, maybe deeply held position that Mexican immigrants were people, quote, with problems, bringing, quote, crime and drugs, that they were, quote, rapists and criminals. And he assured his listeners that he would, quote, build a great, great wall on the southern border, and that Mexico would pay for it. Now, as Greg Grandin makes clear, and as you read, the militarization that a border wall represents was entrenched, and not only at the border, long before the wall, directed at Latinx people and driven by the American myth of frontiersmanship, of white supremacy, and of redemptive violence. The martial longing that's rooted deeply in the American mythos of liberty and equality and self-determination has found its perversity in the mostly unthinking acceptance of a militarized state. And that perversity is especially pronounced just on the other side of that wall, where deported American veterans wait, working towards the glimmer of hope that they might one day be allowed to return to this country whose ideals they risked their lives to uphold and advance, working towards a glimmer of hope that that one day, the day that of their permitted return, will come before their remains are returned to be buried with honors in the soil whose ideals they gave their blood to serve. That perversity is pronounced when U.S. Border Patrol attempts to censor the art, the mural, painted by these deported veterans on the south side of the wall, when the Border Patrol gets into the business of censoring and shaping the living myths of creative expression. And that perversity is no less pronounced when children are caged, when families seeking asylum from the violence of countries whose corrupt governments are the direct result of past CIA involvement, when those folks are given the option of entering and being held within a COVID-infested holding cell, or returning to their countries of origin, where they face certain violence and probable death. America needs to get its house in order. The hope here is that it will at least try to do so, to face its current reckoning and move towards reconciliation before it hands this mess to its children. And America isn't an impersonal entity, as much as it might somehow seem to be, especially to those in positions of relative powerlessness. It's each one of us. Each one of us has a congressional representative who has a phone number and who deserves a piece of your mind, positive or negative, and there's plenty of both. Because there's no defense for not trying. You might fail. Whatever political position you hold, whatever you'd like to see happen in order to move from this extraordinarily polarized political position to a position of reconciliation that might make peace for the coming generations, whatever you see as the best course of attack, the best course of action, you might fail. Mostly you will fail. That's the nature of a large democracy. But the greater failure will be that of those who accept a willful ignorance. The greater failure will be that of those who don't try at all.